Welcome to the JavaScript API video for embedding and interactions. This video is part of a tutorial series, and if you have no idea what the JavaScript API is for Tableau, I recommend checking out the JS API introduction video or the tutorial. However, if you're ready to just hop in and start writing code for the JavaScript API, then you're in the right place. Now for this video, if you'd like to follow along, which I strongly recommend, you can go to github.com/tableau/JS-API-videos and download all of the content. The folder for this video is called O3 Embedding Interactions, and it has all of the HTML and JavaScript that you'll need for this video. We have a few key goals for this video, and those include teaching you how to embed using the JavaScript API, doing some basic interactions such as switching tabs on the embedded workbook, teaching you how to filter the viz, and finally, teaching you how to select marks on that embedded dashboard or visualization. Now we have a couple of prerequisites. We don't need you to be an expert coder or an expert web developer in order to follow along. But you might be confused if you don't know the basics of HTML and JavaScript, if you don't know how to load a JS file in an HTML, or looking at HTML just confuses you. Then you might want to start by watching some videos or some tutorials online teaching you the basics of HTML and JavaScript. Specifically, we will be using JavaScript functions, so if you've never written a custom function in JavaScript, I recommend learning how that works to avoid being confused as we go through some of this code. Let's go ahead and get started. As I said, navigate to github.com/tableau/JS-API-videos and grab all that content. Fire up your favorite text editor. Open up the folder O3 Embedding and Interactions, and you'll notice there's 4 key files in there: JS API, embed interactions.html, and JS. Those are the finished product. That will be our end goal. So if you'd like to open that up and see where you're going, you can go ahead and do that. But the files where we'll be looking are JS embed interactions beginning.html and JS. This has the bare bones HTML and JavaScript necessary to follow along with us. So open those up and get ready. Now here's the website we'll be working on today. As you can see, it has a logo, it's got a title, and it's got some buttons with some styling to them. The middle is where the dashboard will end up going. That obviously hasn't happened yet because we're going to write the code to do that. And these buttons don't do anything because we'll write the JavaScript API functions that control the viz from these custom HTML buttons. All right, open up the code in your favorite text editor. Side note here, I'm using Visual Studio Code because it's a nice open source free text editor with a lot of functionality for web development. But you can use whatever text editor you like, Sublime, Atom, whichever text editor you like, as long as it has some functionality for coding as opposed to just your Windows Notepad. Another side note about following along is in order to avoid having to actually watch me type character by character, I'll essentially be pasting in snippets into the code here, and then I'll be describing the key parts of that code. If you're following along, feel free, in fact, it's probably the best thing to do, to hit pause after I describe that individual snippet of code so that you have time to actually type out all of the pieces of that snippet. I think after you see a couple of these, you'll get a good rhythm on how to follow along with me. Now let's start in our HTML file. Allow me to point out some key parts of the HTML that's already been written here. It's got a header, and it's loading a CSS file called Bootstrap. This is basically the scaffolding for our website and the styling. You don't need to know too much about it, but if you're curious, just Google Twitter Bootstrap. Down below, we have buttons that will control our visualization. So there's a button to filter or to switch the tab to tree map. There's a button for show books, and of course, there are a variety of other buttons. What these buttons do is not switch to a different website, but they call our custom functions called switch view, show, and select marks. These are our functions that we will write in JavaScript. They're currently empty, and we'll simply write the code that utilizes the JavaScript API. All right, let's get started actually writing the JavaScript API code. The first thing to do is to actually access the API and load our custom JS file. On lines 11 and 12, you see the code for loading the JavaScript API. This Tableau-2.js is a JavaScript file that's already been made for you, and it lives on your installation of Tableau server, or if you use Tableau Online or Public, it also lives there. So we need to use a script tag to load that Tableau-2.js. Also, all of the JavaScript code we'll write today lives in this JS API embed interactions beginning.js file. So we need to be sure to load that as well. The only other thing we need to do here in the HTML is tell the HTML, which will eventually tell our JavaScript, where do we want the dashboard. Do we want it up above the title? No. We want it down below the title after all of the menu items. So here it is. The way we do that is with an empty div, a div tag with nothing in it, but we do need to specify an ID. I like to call it my viz, but it doesn't really matter as long as it's something that you'll be able to remember when we go to our .js file. That's it for the HTML. Let's hop on over to JS API embed interactions beginning.js. Actually, before I do that, I forgot to hit save. So that's a good reminder to everyone to hit save, because we won't be returning back to this HTML file today. Now, as you can see here, this JS file just has a variety of functions. Again, these are our custom functions that we will write our code to so that our HTML, when clicked, will call Tableau JavaScript API functions. Now, the first thing to do is to initialize the viz variable. It's pretty standard to just call our viz variable just viz, so var viz, and we have it ready to go. Now, in case you're wondering why I am loading this on line 2, it's because we want this viz variable to be global to this JS file, but we don't want it to be global to the entire space. So we'll load it on line 2, and then later when we actually load the dashboard, that's how we'll access the API. The next step is to actually load the viz. Now, there's a few key ingredients that we need to use to load the viz. But one key thing to note here is that we're doing this in window.onload. This is just a JavaScript function that loads when the HTML is done loading. We don't want to load the dashboard before everything else is done loading, and we have to wait until the other .js file is done loading. So we always try to load our dashboard in this window.onload function. So our first ingredient is the viz div. Remember that empty div that we created in our HTML with the ID of my viz. This is how we tell the JavaScript API where to put the dashboard or visualization. We use this default JavaScript function called document.getElementID to point back at that myViz div. MyViz, of course, is the ID. So whatever you named your ID for that div is what you pass into this function. We store the result of that in this variable called visDiv. The next ingredient is the URL of our visualization. Where does it live? Is it on your local instance of Tableau server, or is it on public or online? And what is its URL? Save that into a string and store that in a variable called visURL. And the last ingredient we need is what's known as an options object. So this is just a JavaScript object stored in a variable called options. And it contains the options for how do we want to load this dashboard. So the most common ones are width and height. How large do you want this to be on our web page? But it also can do things like hide the toolbar and hide the tabs. There's a variety of options you can add to this options object, so I recommend checking that out on the JavaScript API developer docs to see all of the different options. All right, we have our three ingredients, those three variables. Now we need to actually pass those in to load the visualization into our website. And we do that with a function called tableau.viz. So we call new tableau.viz, and we pass in those three arguments from up above. We'll take the return of that call, of that instantiation of the viz, and we'll store it back in our variable, our viz variable. All right, we have our ingredients. As soon as window.onload happens, we're going to load our visualization and store it in a variable called viz. But for now, that should be enough to get our dashboard embedded inside of our website. So I'm going to hit Control-S, save, go back to my browser, and hit refresh. Same website is there, except for now my dashboard is loaded. And of course, this is a live dashboard. These buttons don't yet work. So let's hop back into our JavaScript and hook those functions up to some JavaScript API code. Now, if you've gotten to this point and your code isn't working, it's not loading the dashboard for some reason, be sure to hit pause here and figure out why. Remember, you always have that other finished HTML and JavaScript, so you can copy paste the code if necessary. All right, let's hop back into our code here. The first function we'll write is called switch view. This is just a function that allows us to click on switch to tree map, switch to line chart, and we want it to switch the tab. The code for that is relatively simple, but first we need to get the workbook. So we have our viz object in that variable called viz. We can't call activate sheet on that viz object. We have to call it on the workbook. So the first step is to call viz.getWorkbook, save it in a variable called workbook, and now we can do things like switching from tab to tab, which we do there on line 20, workbook.activateSheetAsync. The only thing you need to pass in to activate sheet async is a string of the name of the viz. In this case, which viz do we switch to? Whichever the one the user chose in our HTML. So our HTML passes us the sheet name. We take that and we pass it back to activate sheet async. That's all we need to do. So I'll hit save, hop back to Chrome, hit refresh, and now our buttons under switching views work. Great. Now a side note here, I hope you're starting to see the value of the JavaScript API. If you publish a dashboard in Tableau, you can already switch from tab to tab. So this isn't new functionality, but what it allows us to do is hide those tabs and create them in our own way. We're switching to tabs not in those default tabs at the top, but in our own custom stylized buttons that happen on the left-hand side of the screen. All right, now let's hop back into our code and write the code for filtering our visualization. Now, I want to point out how this show function works. So I'll go back to our HTML and I'll show you what the idea is. When the user clicks on that button, Show Books, we want to call that function show. And we want to pass in the name of a dimension as well as the name of a value or list of values that we want to filter that dimension on. So when the user clicks that, show me only the rows for which category equals book. Let's hop back into our show function and actually write that code. And here's what it looks like. Now on line 25, we need to go all the way down to the sheet level. Remember in Switch View, we could only do that at the workbook level, not at the viz level. Well, to apply a filter, we can't do that at the workbook level. We have to go even one step further down to the sheet level. So we do that by calling viz.getWorkbook, which we've already seen, and then we go one step further to get active sheet. That will give us the active sheet object, which, by the way, we can only filter to the active sheet, not to sheets that aren't being shown. We grab the active sheet and we store it in a variable called sheet, and that gets us ready to call the filter function, which we do with sheet.applyFilterAsync. ApplyFilterAsync takes 3 arguments. The first is the name of the dimension we want to filter on. In this case, we grab that directly from the user selection, which in this case was category. And then we also pass in the values to filter to. In this case, again, we grab those from the user selection, in this case, book. Finally, we need to pass in what's known as a filter update type. What this means is, how do we want the behavior of the filter to occur? I like to think of this as, what kind of quick filter are we using? Think about a multi-select quick filter. If you click a new checkbox, that adds the value. So you might be showing one category, you click a new checkbox, and now you're showing 2 categories, and then you can add another 3rd and 4th. The equivalent to that would not be replace, it would be add. Also on a multi-select quick filter, you could deselect an item. We're showing categories 1 and 2, deselect 2 and only show 1. That is more like remove. But we've done here instead is replace. So that's kind of like a single select quick filter. I'm showing category 1 and I click on 3. Now I only show 3. And that's what we want here. No matter which values are being shown, when I want to filter to book, I want to see only books. That's it for apply filter async. I'll go ahead and hit Control S once again to save, open up my browser, and hit refresh. Of course, the dashboard loads once again, but now not only can I switch views, I can also filter to just book objects. All right, great. We have one last thing, which is select electronics marks, which doesn't yet work. Let's go back into the code here and fill this out. Now, what you notice about select marks is that it looks very similar to filtering, and that's purposeful. The behavior is very similar. So on line 31, it's identical to line 25. We have to select marks on the active sheet. Now, again, once we have our sheet, we call sheet.selectMarksAsync, just like ApplyFilterAsync, and we pass in 3 arguments. First, the name of the dimension we want to determine how to select on. Second, the name of the values. So again, it's category. In this case, it's electronics is the values instead of book. And third, the filter or selection update type. If I've already selected some things, do I want to replace all those selections with my new selection, or do I want to add or remove? In this case, I want to replace. So once again, Control S, save, switch on over to Chrome and refresh that. Now I'm looking at all of my categories here, and I can click on Select Electronics Marks, and just those marks are selected. It works like filtering, but instead of actually filtering, it just selects those marks. Of course, this also works on any of the other sheets. That's pretty much it from here. We've taught you how to do some of the key basic things of the JavaScript API: embedding, filtering, switching tabs, and selecting marks. In fact, most use cases of the JavaScript API, this will make up 80% of what people use it for. So hopefully we've gotten you pretty far. You can start to combine these in creative ways for your own use cases. Let's talk about where to go from here. As always, the best place to go to is developers.tableau.com, a one-stop shop for finding out anything about the JavaScript API, including JavaScript API developer docs. You can go do a hands-on introductory tutorial if you haven't done that. You can also check out docs and other resources on our other APIs, as well as our SDK, anything related to extensibility, Tableau development, etc. And one of the greatest things about the developer portal is that it gives you a link to the community forums, which is a really good place to talk to other people who are tinkering with Tableau's APIs and that kind of thing. Also, go to youtube.com. If you haven't done this already, search for #DataDev, and you'll find a playlist of all Tableau developer-related tutorials, including this video series and video series on other APIs and extensibility-related subjects. You've probably already done this, but if you haven't grabbed all the code, feel free to always return to github.com/tableau/JS-API videos, which will include all the code we used today, the code for the other videos in this series, as well as the PowerPoints that we went through today. That's it for now. Feel free to go start building some of your own projects. If you'd like to join us to get more into the intermediate advanced stuff, there's a video called Tips and Tricks where we'll start to do a lot of that. Thanks for joining us today. Goodbye.